The flour mill's assessment came back with a value of $40, not $40,000, not $440. 3 acres of flood-prone bottomland along the Hatchie River, a stone building the county inspector called structurally compromised, and a water wheel nobody had turned in 60 years. All of it appraised at less than a decent pair of work boots. Her ex-husband's attorney had actually laughed when he read the line aloud. Not meanly. Just the way a man laughs at something that doesn't matter. That was the only item on the entire settlement sheet that Lena Croft walked away with. Lena was 53 years old. She had $847 in a checking account that had been hers before the marriage, and remained hers through the lawyer's agreement, mostly because Dennis hadn't noticed it. She drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard, and a front passenger window that fogged on the inside no matter the season. She had no apartment. She'd been staying in the back bedroom of her friend Wanda's house for 6 weeks, sleeping on a daybed under a quilt that belonged to Wanda's daughter, and eating cereal at 7 in the morning, while Wanda's kids got ready for school, because that was the arrangement, and Wanda was kind enough not to make it feel like charity. What she had, besides the car and the $847, was a folded deed on the passenger seat, and a 2-hour drive south into a part of West Tennessee she hadn't visited in 11 years. Her mother had left the mill property when she died the previous March. A cold, quick death from pneumonia that had given Lena about 4 days between the phone call and the funeral. She'd come down, handled the arrangements, signed what the attorney told her to sign, driven back to Nashville, and put the property out of her mind, the way you put a thing in a drawer when you don't know what to do with it yet. Dennis had said it wasn't worth the carrying costs. Lena hadn't argued. She rarely argued with Dennis. That had been the shape of the marriage, though no one ever named it out loud. The deed was soft at the creases from sitting in a filing cabinet drawer for 14 months, and when Lena unfolded it at a gas station outside of Jackson to check the address, the paper felt like cloth. Croft Family Mill, Hatchie County, deeded to Lena Marie Croft under the last will and testament of Gwendolyn Adair Croft, deceased. Her mother had bought the ruin 30 years ago, with money from the sale of the family house in Memphis, over the objections of everyone who knew about it, and had spent the back half of her life tending to it, the way other women tend to gardens, slowly, quietly, without explaining herself to anyone. Lena had thought the whole thing was eccentric. Dennis had called it a money pit. Now the money pit was all she had. She drove the last 40 minutes on a 2-lane state road that ran through soybean fields and small towns with dollar stores and Baptist churches. And then the road dropped down into the river bottomland, and the light changed the way it does when you go from open country to tree cover. Green and close and different. She crossed a low bridge over a creek she remembered from childhood, turned onto a gravel lane that wasn't on the navigation app, and followed it through a stand of bald cypress until the trees thinned and the mill came into view. She sat with the engine running for a long moment. The building was stone, 2 stories, with walls thick enough that she knew without checking they'd hold another 100 years whether anyone was in them or not. The water wheel on the east side had lost several of its paddles and tilted at the top like a man mid-shrug, but the axle was still there, still connected to whatever was inside. Kudzu had made a serious run at the north face and gotten about halfway up before something had stopped it. She'd find out later it was her mother, working at it every fall with a pair of loppers and a stubbornness the kudzu couldn't match. The door was plank wood, unpainted, with a black iron latch. The whole place smelled, even through the car window, like river mud and old stone and something green she didn't have a name for. It smelled like every summer she'd ever spent here as a child. She'd come to sell it, get a number from a realtor, find some hobby farmer who wanted a project, take whatever they offered, and start over somewhere that didn't have 11 years of absence built into it. She meant to do that. She meant to be practical. Instead, she unlocked the door. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe to Grand Stories and tap the bell. 'Cause what Lena found when she started looking at what her mother had actually been doing down here for 30 years is the kind of thing that changes the way you think about the people closest to you. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go inside. The ground floor was one open room with a plank floor worn smooth in the center from generations of foot traffic. The old millstone sat in the corner, like a piece of furniture somebody had given up moving. The walls were shelved on 2 sides, and the shelves held what you'd expect from a woman who'd spent 30 years in a place by herself. Mason jars, hand tools, A row of Tennessee almanacs going back to 1993, a first aid kit the size of a shoebox, 3 different sizes of flashlight, and a coffee percolator that looked like it had been used that morning. On a hook by the door hung her mother's canvas jacket, the one with the torn pocket she'd safety pinned shut sometime around 2010, and never gotten around to mending. Lena pressed her face into it the way you do without deciding to. It smelled like cedar and river air and the particular warmth of a room her mother had been alive in. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying in March, alone in the car after the graveside service, while Dennis sat in the church fellowship hall, eating a ham biscuit and making conversation with people he'd never met and would never see again. That particular well had already run out. She looked around the room the way a person looks at a problem. The millstone was decorative at best. The shelves could be sold with the building. The percolator she'd take. She told herself that, and then she did what she always did when she didn't know what to do next, which was make coffee. She found grounds in a tin above the sink, filled the percolator from a hand pump that still worked, set it on the wood burner in the corner, and sat on a low stool and waited for it to heat. Outside, the river moved over its stones with a sound like someone in the next room turning pages. She stayed that night because the drive back felt long and the daybed at Wanda's felt longer. She found a cot rolled in the back room with a canvas cover over it and a wool blanket in a cedar chest that her mother had clearly kept ready for something, and she slept on it hard, the way you sleep in a place where the air is different from the air you're used to. She woke at first light to the sound of the river and to something else, boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, moving toward the building. Lena came off the cot and stood very still. The footsteps stopped outside the door. There was a pause, the weight of someone thinking, and then a knock. Not urgent, not tentative. The knock of a person who expected no one and was announcing themselves out of courtesy anyway. She opened the door. The woman on the step was maybe 70, small and straight-backed, in rubber wading boots and a denim shirt rolled to the elbows. She had a metal pail in one hand and an expression on her face that was not surprise exactly, but the adjustment a person makes when a fact they expected to stay unchanged has quietly changed. "Didn't see your car last night," the woman said. "Wasn't sure anybody was up here." "I parked around back," Lena said. "Can I help you?" The woman looked past her into the room, at the percolator on the burner, at the cot visible through the back doorway. She nodded once to herself the way people do when they're confirming something they already suspected. "I'm Trudy Sapp," she said. "I run the fish camp down the bend. I've been coming up here twice a week for 11 years to keep the pump primed and run the wood burner for a couple hours so the floor joints don't swell." She held up the pail, and to bring water up from the spring when the pump runs slow, which it does in dry months. Lena stared at her. "My mother never told me anyone was doing that," she said. Trudy Sapp almost smiled. "Your mother never told much of anybody much of anything," she said. "You must be the daughter, Lena. She talked about you." Trudy set the pail down on the step. "Not a lot, but enough." She looked at the building again, the way you look at something you've been responsible for. "I'll leave you to it. Just wanted you to know somebody's been watching the place." "Why?" Lena said, and she didn't mean it to come out with the weight it did, but it did. "Why did you keep doing it? For 11 years, for someone? For a place you don't own?" Trudy Sapp was quiet for a moment. The river turned its pages. "Because your mama asked me to," she said. "And because she never once asked for anything she didn't have a reason for." She picked up her pail and walked back down the gravel lane without further explanation, and Lena stood in the doorway, watching her go, and understood nothing and felt, for the first time in several months, that there might be something here worth understanding. She didn't call the realtor that day. She told herself it was because she didn't have cell service, which was true. She told herself it was because she needed to see the state of the place before she could price it honestly, which was also true. The truer thing was that Trudy Sapp's question, she never asked for anything she didn't have a reason for, had set a hook in her the way a clean question does, and she wasn't ready to leave before she knew what the reason was. She went through the place carefully that second day, not packing it up, just looking, the way you look when you suspect a room of holding something back. What she found slowly was evidence of a habit. The shelves had supplies for one person, but the back room had 2 cots, not one. The cabinet under the south window held 6 mismatched mugs, far more than a woman living alone would need. On the highest shelf, behind a row of almanacs, she found a basket with a change of women's clothes in it, jeans and a flannel shirt, washed and folded, sized for someone younger and smaller than her mother. In the cabinet above the pump, there was a row of amber prescription bottles, all empty, all different names. Not her mother's prescriptions, different names on different bottles, the kind that someone might have been glad to have refilled, but hadn't found a way to manage. She stood at that shelf for a long time. On the evening of her second day, she went down the lane to Trudy Sapp's fish camp, which turned out to be 3 wooden cabins and a bait shack at a bend in the river where the bank was low and sandy. Trudy was on the porch with coffee, as if she'd expected the visit. The extra cot, Lena said. The basket of clothes. The prescription bottles. Trudy looked at the river. She nodded. She'd want me to let you figure it out yourself, she said. She was particular about that. But I'll tell you it's in her letters if you find them. Lena went back and looked harder. The letters were in the millstone, not in it, but behind it, in the 2-inch gap between the stone and the wall that she'd assumed was just the settlement of an old building. Her mother had used the gap the way someone else might use a safe. A wide flat tin, the kind fruitcakes come in at Christmas, pressed into the space and sealed at the edge with electrical tape gone brittle. Inside the tin were 2 leather-bound composition notebooks, the kind you'd find at any 5 and dime, fat with use, and beneath them, a bundle of letters secured with a rubber band so old it broke when she touched it. She brought the tin to the table and opened the first notebook. Her mother's handwriting, small, left-leaning, the way it had always been. October 14th. A girl named Sandra came to the door just after dark. She'd walked from the highway, she said, 4 miles. She had a bruise on her forearm and a 7-year-old boy asleep on her back. I gave her the back room and a bowl of soup, and I did not ask her a single question she didn't volunteer. In the morning I drove her to a woman I know in Covington who helps with situations like hers. I left $20 in her jacket pocket and didn't say so. The door here is never locked. Lena read the line twice. She turned the page. The next entry was 2 weeks later. A different name, a man this time, a trucker who'd lost his license and walked off a job site in a direction he said he couldn't explain. Ended up at the river, saw the light her mother kept burning in the window and followed it up the lane, fed him and let him sleep on the cot. He talked for 2 hours about a thing that happened in a truck stop in Alabama 15 years ago that he'd never told his wife. I didn't tell him what to do about it. I just let it sit in the air between us until it wasn't so heavy for him. He left in the morning looking like a man who'd set down a suitcase he'd been carrying since he was 32. Told him he could come back if he needed. Page after page after page. If you've come this far with Lena, do us a favor and subscribe to Grand Stories. Because what was in those notebooks is the thing that turns this story from a story about a mill into a story about what a whole river county knew about a woman her own daughter didn't. 31 years of entries. A different name in nearly every one. Women from the county shelter who needed somewhere that wasn't on a list. Men walking off the kinds of nights that don't have names. Teenagers who'd been put out of houses that were supposed to hold them. The occasional person who'd simply driven until the road ended, and found at the end of it, a light in a stone building, and a woman who opened the door without asking why they'd come. At the end of almost every entry, the same line in one form or another. The door here is never locked. Lena read them for 4 hours straight, until the light went and she had to light the kerosene lamp on the table. The same lamp, she realized, that her mother had kept in the window every night. She'd lit it by reflex. She hadn't known she was repeating anything. The bundle of letters was 63 envelopes, each addressed to the lady at the mill, or Gwen, or simply the woman on the hatchie. She opened them one by one and read them in the lamplight, and what was in them was the same thing always. Gratitude in all the shapes. Gratitude takes when a person finally finds a place to put it. A woman named Sandra who wrote that she'd driven past the mill road 11 times over 3 years. Before she'd had the courage to turn down it, and that the soup in the cot and the $20 in her jacket had been the whole difference between what happened next and what almost happened. A man who said he'd paid the $20 forward so many times he'd lost count. A teenage boy, the handwriting careful and large, who'd written only, "You didn't ask me anything. I didn't know that was allowed." She set that one down. She went and stood in the doorway and looked at the river in the dark and stayed there until her coffee went cold. She called the realtor the next morning. From the gravel lot outside the fish camp, the one bar of signal she could find. She made an appointment to meet him on Thursday. Then she drove to the town of Porterfield, 6 miles up the state road, and bought 2 weeks of groceries, a new can of primer for the door, a box of sandpaper, and a roll of weather stripping. She told herself she was just stabilizing the property before listing it. She told herself that, through the first morning of sanding and through the second afternoon of rehanging the shutter over the south window that had come loose from its frame. She told herself that until Thursday came, and she met the realtor in the gravel lane and showed him around, and watched him look at the millstone and the water wheel and the kudzu scar on the north wall, with the practiced expression of a man calculating discount. "It's got character," he said, which was realtor, for it has problems. "What do you think it'll list for?" she asked. He named a number. It was less than what she'd spent on groceries, not the total, 1 week of groceries. She shook his hand, said she'd call him, and watched him back down the lane in his clean car. And then, she stood in the clearing with the river going over its stones, and the mill standing square behind her, with its 30-year-old walls. And she thought about the notebook entry she'd read the night before. A widow from Selmer, who'd sat at the table and told her mother about a son in prison and a granddaughter she was raising alone and a water bill she couldn't pay. And her mother had written, "I can't fix most of what's broken for her, but I can make sure she leaves with enough to clear the bill and know somebody listened. That part's not hard. Most of it's just not looking away." She didn't call the realtor back. She was still at the mill 3 weeks later when the silver Escalade came up the lane. It was a Saturday. She and Trudy had spent the morning pulling kudzu off the north wall, and had just come in for coffee when they heard the engine, big and quiet and expensive, sounding in a way that felt slightly wrong on a gravel lane in Bottomland, Tennessee. The man who got out was 60-something, neat in a polo shirt and khakis, with the unhurried quality of someone who's learned through experience that unhurried project's more authority than urgent. He looked at the mill, the way a person looks at a thing they've already priced. "Harlan Co.," he said, extending his hand toward Lena. "Co River Holdings. You're the owner?" Lena Croft. She didn't take the hand. "I made your mother 2 offers over the last decade," he said, not particularly bothered by the hand. "Generous ones both times. She wasn't interested in selling, which I respected. But circumstances change, and I heard through the county office that the property had transferred, so I thought I'd come by and introduce myself in person." He turned a slow look at the whole place. The mill, the water wheel, the bend of the river through the cypress. "There's a 400-acre tract I've got under option from the ridge down to the county road. The hatchy frontage is the whole point of it. Without this quarter-mile of bank," he gestured at the water, "the development doesn't have what it needs. With it, we're talking about a boutique resort situation. Cabins, a fly fishing operation, farm to table, the whole package." He named a figure then. It was not a small figure. "I'm told you're in a transitional period," he said, "which I understand, and I want you to know this offer is meant to make that transition easier, not to take advantage of it." Transitional period. Dennis had used that phrase too, at the end. The same comfortable little word for a thing that wasn't comfortable at all. Lena looked at Harlan Co. She felt the old pull, the learned reflex of a marriage that had spent 21 years teaching her to smooth the air in a room, to make the discomfort of others into her responsibility, to agree so that everyone could leave feeling fine. She felt it. And then she felt something else underneath it, something that had been there all along, and was only now solid enough to stand on. The notebooks, the 63 letters, the basket of folded clothes behind the almanacs, the prescription bottles with other people's names. "The door here is never locked." "Miss Co," she said, "this property isn't for sale." He nodded the way men like that nod when they've heard a first no, patient, unsurprised, ready to move to the second conversation. "I understand," he said. "Take some time, I can." "I'm not asking for time," she said. "I'm telling you it isn't for sale now and it won't be. The same way it wasn't for sale when my mother was alive." Something shifted behind his eyes. "The recalibration you can see if you're looking for it. I'd hate for you to make that decision before you've looked at this practically," he said. "That building needs significant work to be livable, let alone marketable. Code requirements alone will be met," she said. "The access easement to the lane is recorded," said a voice from behind Lena. Trudy Sapp had come out of the mill with her coffee mug and was leaning against the doorframe with the specific stillness of a woman who has watched this kind of conversation from a distance many times. "The access easement was recorded in 1987, Trudy said. "Gwen made sure of that the year she bought it. And the building passed structural inspection in 2019. Your office may not know that, but the county building department does because I drove her there myself." She sipped her coffee. So, Harlan Coe looked at Trudy Sapp. He looked at Lena. He did the calculation visible in the flattening of his smile. "Think it over," he said, and got back in the Escalade, and back down the lane with the particular care of a man who knows the conversation isn't over but has chosen to call this round a pause. Stay with us. Because what Trudy Sapp told Lena that evening on the porch, about what Gwen Croft had done 20 years before any of this, before Harlan Coe was even looking at this county, is the reason that Escalade was never coming back. Subscribe to Grand Stories if you haven't already, because the next part is the whole thing. Trudy had known about the letters. She hadn't read them. Gwen had kept those private. But she'd known what they were about. The way you know the shape of something you've watched for years without being told its name. "Your mother started keeping the door unlocked in 1992. Trudy said. "I know because that's the year my niece Brenda walked down that lane at 2 in the morning with 2 bags. And a decision she'd made about her husband. And your mother was the one who helped her make it stick." She looked at the river. I asked Gwen afterward how long she'd been doing it. She said she'd done it once before Brenda, a man she'd found sleeping in the cypress grove down the bank, and she'd fed him, and he'd helped her fix the water wheel housing. And he'd left the next morning, and sent her a postcard from Chattanooga 3 months later that just said thank you for not asking. She said she figured that was enough reason to keep the light on. Lena thought of the teenage boy's letter. "You didn't ask me anything. I didn't know that was allowed." "She never told me," Lena said. "She didn't tell anybody, not till they were gone." Trudy paused. That was the point, I think. If people knew she was doing it, it became a thing people knew about, and then it wasn't safe for the ones who needed it to stay quiet. That night Lena opened the second notebook, the one she'd left for last. It was newer than the first, the leather darker, and when she turned to the final entries the ink was from the last 6 months of her mother's life. She found her own name in the second-to-last entry. "Called Lena tonight." She sounded like a woman trying to hold a shape she'd outgrown. You can hear it, the way she gives way in a conversation before she's really finished, the way she laughs a little too quickly at things that aren't quite funny. She always did that when she didn't know how to be sad and right at the same time. I didn't push. I asked about the garden. She told me Dennis wanted to pave it over for parking, and I said that was a shame about the garden, which it was. I wish she'd come here. I wish she'd sit with me on the step and watch the river and remember she was someone before she was someone's wife and someone's daughter-in-law and someone's assistant. She won't. Maybe not yet. But the door's not locked, Lena. Come when you're ready. I'll keep the light on. She closed the notebook and pressed it flat against her chest, the way you hold something that might otherwise escape. And then she did what she'd told herself she hadn't done in months. She cried. Not for the marriage she'd lost, or the apartment she didn't have, or the daybed at Wanda's, or the $847, or the cracked dashboard, or any of the ledger items of her smaller managed too agreeable life. She cried for her mother, who had kept a light on for 30 years for everyone who needed one, including a daughter who hadn't known to walk toward it until there was nothing left to lose. She wasn't going to sell this place. She'd known it for a week. Now she knew why. In the morning she drove to Porterfield and sat in the booth at the diner, where 3 people stopped by to say something to her that they'd been holding. An old man who said Gwen had once loaned him her truck for a week after his broke down, and he'd never been able to repay her. And would Lena please take the pie from the counter on her way out? A woman named Adele, maybe 60, who sat across from her and folded her hands and said without preamble, "Your mother sat with me the night I thought I wouldn't make it through. She didn't call anyone I didn't want called. She just made coffee and stayed till morning. My daughter is 11 now." She stood up. I don't have the words for the rest of it, but I wanted the person who came after her to know. Lena took the pie. She understood now that she hadn't inherited a mill. She'd inherited a practice. A 30-year discipline of showing up at a door that stayed unlocked. She'd inherited the notebooks, and the 63 letters, and the empty prescription bottles, and the basket of clothes sized for someone else. And she'd inherited the reason for all of it, which was nothing grand. Nothing explainable. Just the stubborn daily choice to be a place where a person could set down whatever they'd been carrying long enough to breathe. Harlan Coe came back 3 weeks later. Not himself this time. His attorney, a younger man with a better suit, who came up the lane carrying a folder and left it on the step when Lena didn't open the door. Inside were 3 documents. A structural concern notice filed with the county building office, a letter questioning the validity of the 1987 access easement, and an offer sheet revised upward by 40%. She didn't open the offer sheet. She called the county building office herself the next morning. The structural concern had been filed, correctly, because filing one costs nothing. But the office had no record of any inspection outcome pending and no action authorized. The woman on the phone said it didn't sound like much and gave Lena the number of the county's staff inspector. Then Lena drove to the library in Porterfield and asked the librarian, a woman named Joan, who turned out to be Trudy Sapp's second cousin, whether she knew anyone with legal experience in property matters. Joan made one phone call. The man who arrived at the mill 2 days later was not a lawyer, but knew more about Hatchie County deed records than most lawyers did. Because he'd spent 40 years as the county clerk. His name was August Pryor and he was 78, and he drove a truck older than Lena, and he sat at the table and looked through the 1987 easement documents for 11 minutes and then set them down. That easement is clean, he said. Has been since the day she filed it. I remember because your mother came in to file it herself on a Tuesday, paid the filing fee in exact change, and said to me, he paused and seemed to be getting the words right. She said, I just need this to be on record, August, so it can't be undone after I'm gone. And I said, it'll be there as long as the county is, and she said, that'll do. He patted the papers. That's the extent of it. That'll do. Lena showed him the folder Coe's attorney had left. He went through it with the focus of a man who does not waste his attention. These are pressure tactics, he said, not legal claims. The structural concern is an unverified filing. The easement challenge is a letter on letterhead, not a motion. He's hoping you don't know the difference. He set the folder down. I can help you write a response that makes clear you do. They wrote it at the table that afternoon. Lena and August Pryor and Trudy Sapp, who'd come in halfway through without being asked and taken the third chair, and contributed 2 precise sentences that turned out to be the sharpest in the document. They sent it to Coe's attorney by certified mail. Subscribe and stay with me, because the thing Gwen Croft did in 1992, the first night she left the door unlocked, the first time she wrote a name in the notebook, is the reason Harlan Coe never came back up that lane. And it has nothing to do with legal documents. The response went out on a Friday. The following Tuesday, Adele, the woman from the diner, whose daughter was 11, called Lena to tell her that Harlan Coe had been trying to acquire a tract from the Sapp family for the past 2 years, the fish camp land at the river bend, without which the Hatchie frontage was broken and the resort concept didn't work. Trudy had turned him down twice. What Coe had been doing with the mill wasn't building a case. He'd been trying to isolate Lena from the one neighbor who held the piece that mattered, the way you separate the piece you need before you make a move on the one you can't have. Trudy Sapp knew this already. She'd known it when he first drove up the lane. I wanted to see what you were made of, Trudy told Lena that night on the step, not unkindly, the way a woman says a true thing. And? Lena said. Trudy looked at the lamp in the window. Your mother put that light in the window every night for 30 years, she said. You lit it the first night you were here before you even knew what it meant. That told me most of what I needed to know. Harlan Coe's attorney sent one more letter 3 weeks later. It was brief and technical, and it went nowhere because there was nowhere for it to go. The easement was recorded. The access was clear. The building stood on its own stone. A developer without the river bend and without the mill frontage had neither the view nor the water feature his concept required, and Trudy Sapp had already told him, in a letter of her own, that the fish camp was not available at any price he could name, because it had been in her family since 1954 and was going to stay that way. The silver Escalade did not come back. Lena heard about it from August Pryor, who heard about it from Joan at the library, who heard it from a friend at the county assessor's office. Coe's option on the 400 acres had been allowed to expire. Without the river, there was nothing to hold the investment together. Lena was at the mill when she heard. She was repainting the door. That evening she opened the second notebook to a blank page near the back and wrote the date at the top in the uphill slant that turned out to be her natural hand, the one she'd inherited without knowing it. She wrote down what had happened in the 6 weeks since she'd arrived with $847 and a plan to be practical. The cot, Trudy, the fruitcake tin, the notebooks, the letters, August Pryor, Adele, the response of the attorney. And at the bottom, because it was the only way to end it that felt true, she wrote, the door here is never locked. Come when you're ready. She sat with that for a while, and then she tore the page out and tucked it into the new notebook she'd bought at the Five and Dime in Porterfield. A blank composition book, same kind her mother had used, with a black and white cover. She set it on the shelf where the almanacs were. Then she went to refill the lamp. The first entry in her own handwriting came 11 days later, on a night in early November when the temperature dropped hard, and a woman in her 40s with a car that had quit on the state road, and a situation she wasn't ready to name, walked down the gravel lane because she could see, from where her car had stopped, a single yellow light burning through the cypress. Lena opened the door before she knocked. She put soup on and didn't ask a single question the woman wasn't ready to answer. She made up the back cot with the good blanket from the cedar chest. And in the morning, when the woman's car started on the third try, and she came to say goodbye in the way of someone who doesn't quite know how, Lena put $20 in her jacket pocket without saying so, and wrote the name down in the new notebook. She came in the dark toward the light. I let her stay. She left looking like she'd set something down. The door here is never locked. The river moved over its stones outside, patient and unhurried, the way a river moves when it's been at a thing for a long time and intends to keep at it. Lena Croft was 53 years old. She had a cracked Davbird Civic, a part-time arrangement at Trudy's fish camp to keep the propane funded, a mill her mother had loved for 30 years, and a new notebook on the shelf with one entry in it, and 62 blank pages to go. She trimmed the wick, set the lamp in the window, and watched the light spread out into the dark, the way a small thing does when there's nothing else around to compete with it. Steady and simple and further reaching than it had any right to be. She'd come here to sell a ruin and leave by morning. She was just getting started.